Our subject is networks. We kept changing what came after that. It was once networks in the future of social science. It's down to this. Probably the best thing to do is to just say it's about networks. We're going to have variations on a theme which we think will add up to something, at least a good conversation. It did when we were talking about it. Bill is going to talk about the concept of network as a general framework for analyzing society. I'm going to talk about networks in political communication and how they have changed historically. And Michael is going to talk about the data that is generated in online networks and how social scientists should relate to it. And we decided to take advantage of the fact that we've reversed polarity in this room and we've got rid of the lights and we have this nice table here, and we're going to have a little bit more radical change of format. And that is that we're only going to talk, each of us, for 2 minutes, or that's the plan. You know, with academics, when they say they're going to be brief, wait, I haven't even started my presentation.
Time's up.
And then we're going to throw it open to a general conversation. All of us, of course, have a lot more to say about these things, and if you want to bring us out on things, you're welcome to do it, and you probably have some things to say about some of these things as well. So let me turn it over to Bill.
Okay, I want to go very quickly, and I want to make 3 points, which I won't even preview because I only have 2 minutes. And the first is that networks are not only something in the world, they're a way of looking at the world. And I want to explain that very briefly. In some sense, networks are a paradigm that we can think of as analogous to causal analysis. When we do causal analysis, we look at a lot of people and we look at a lot of variables. And this is sort of the way we think about conventional causal analysis. We have people down on the rows and variables across the top. And what we do is we try to look at the relationships among those variables. So this is a causal path diagram that has nothing to do with the data that I made up before, but this is the kind of thing that we try to do. We have something we want to explain, and we have arrows, lines going between them that are in some sense causal relationships. Well, a network is very much, we can think of in the same way, that we have the same people on the left and the same people across the top. We have data on whether they are connected or not, and we try to find another sort of diagram that is in some sense analogous. The difference is, in this model, people can be connected to each other. In the previous one, we make the untenable assumption that people are not connected to each other, the cases are independent. So it's a way of looking at the world. And we can look at it in all sorts of things. I look at it in terms of songs as links between people. So this is from my data. This is artists linked by common repertoire in 1900. You can see they fall into 2 groups. And then this is a Twitter network. So that's basically the first point, that networks are a way of looking at the world. Second point, and I see my time is already half up, is that network analysis has been changing. That previously it was very mathematical and very much sort of shaped by, okay, very quickly, shaped by the data themselves. The third is that network analysis is now changing the world, that there are some very interesting studies in social science that look at Silicon Valley in terms of the way they are using network analysis to create real-world networks. And so that's sort of where we are now, where network analysis is not only a way to study the world, it's also a way of shaping reality. And it's doing so in some very interesting ways I don't have to talk about. I don't have time to talk about. Okay.
Okay. So I'm Dan Hallin. I am a political scientist by training, and I now teach in a communication department. And in my field, political communication, when we talk about networks, traditionally what we meant was something very concrete, that is ABC, CBS, NBC, as well as Televisa, Doordarshan, and so on, the giants of broadcasting. Today, when we talk about networks in political communication, of course we're thinking about the internet, and the historical change between the age of broadcasting and the age of the internet is a shift, among other things, things toward a much more fragmented public sphere. So it's this fragmentation of the public sphere that I want to put on the table for discussion. It's a shift from a communication system that was organized around media that provided common representations to a mass public toward a media system that is built around targeting audiences and around a structure of niche audiences. There are two kinds of fragmentation that are involved here. One of them is partisanship and the reemergence of partisan media. And the other is simply the division between people who are exposed to political information on a regular basis and an increasing part of the population that is not exposed to political communication on a regular basis. There are a lot of methodological issues that arise from this about sampling, for example. What content should we look at? How should we weight it? And also conceptual issues. How should we think about public opinion? Should we think of it as a unitary thing to begin with? Those are interesting questions. And then there are political or normative questions that I think all of us think about now. That center both around information inequality, which may be growing between segments of the population that have different amounts of information about politics, and also about polarization. When we think about those issues, it's important to keep in mind that there was a critique of the old media system that was centered exactly around its commonness. That was a critique of this system as one that lacked diversity, that didn't give opinion or interpretation, and that also lacked the kind of mobilizing function of old partisan media. But there is a lot that's disturbing about the new system that is perhaps symbolized most dramatically by the fact that partisans often live in such different worlds in terms of their factual assumptions. Here the most famous fact is the fact that 60% of Republicans in 2006 still believed that there had been weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Michael.
So network analysis used to be very structural. It was about how the different network topologies would have different correlates and different outcomes. But what's sometimes called the new science of networks is really about human interaction, how people relate to each other. And the reason why this change is occurring, I think, is really because of data. And the reason why these data are available is because humans all over the world are increasingly choosing to interact with one another using devices that record data about those interactions in great detail. And we can access those data. And now for the first time, we can study human interaction at a micro level, but on a global scale and in a comparative framework. And I think this is really transformative for the social sciences, maybe in the same way that the particle accelerator was for physics, the fMRI for neuroscience, even the microscope and telescope in an earlier era, because it's allowing us to see people interacting on a grand scale. We've always been able to do this, but with very small n in field studies and in lab experiments, where you might have 20, maybe 30 people that you're observing or tracking. And that's fine and good, but it's very limited in what you're able to do. Some of the classic network studies, Elizabeth Bott's studies of kinship networks, 20 people, Zachary's Karate Club, 19 people. And now we can study networks with literally millions of people and billions of interactions. And in addition, we can run laboratory experiments on a massive scale. And actually, Brian Nosek, who's one of the pioneers in this field, is going to be doing a workshop with me at some point in the next few weeks. So I'm going to sort of set that aside, and we're going to talk in some detail for those who are interested in some just sort of hands-on exposure to how do you do an experiment online, a controlled experiment with an N of 10,000 people.
Our objective here was really to put some issues on the table for discussion. And so we want to turn it over to you now.
You said that now, because of Twitter and all sorts of new technologies, we have a new way of observing people interact. But you forget that people themselves, with these new devices, have a way of observing each other interact and participating in absolutely new kinds of interactions. The interactions you're observing did not exist 10 years ago. I mean, nowadays, when I, for instance, want to get a sense of what's happening back in Sweden, I go to my Swedish newspaper and I do not just read articles, but I look at all the direct links to blogs that are linking to that article in order to find out what kind of impact a newspaper article is having on the public sphere. And this is only possible because a new kind of interaction pattern has been emerging. So in a sense, what you're observing is not something old, which has now become observable, but an entirely new phenomenon. While at the same time, interactions behind closed doors, interactions that depend on government's interaction order, on politeness rituals, and all these things that face-to-face interaction enforces, are still happening. And those you still cannot observe.
Well, I think it's a great point, but I would just point out a few other aspects of this. One is that people like Sandy Pentland at MIT are increasingly studying face-to-face interactions by putting apps on the cell phones of students at MIT, for example, and these network sensors can track face-to-face interaction. There are also lots of familiar types of interactions that we can still now get data for. For instance, the study that we did on using the telephone records of the UK for all the phone calls in the UK. Well, people have been making phone calls for 100 years. So some of the things are old and some of the things are new. Running laboratory experiments online, you could say it's new because the N's are very large and the participants are not all college sophomores. But the controls that you would do and the manipulations, actually you can replicate classic experiments. So in some cases we can do exactly what we were doing before, and in other cases we are studying some of the new phenomena and the new ways that people interact in a connected age.
I think there's an important, we wanted this to be a discussion, so I'm going to jump in too. That I think there's an important point that some of the forms of interaction are new. But there's also, one of the things that's changing about society is the sort of tracers that interaction leave. And as social scientists, we've been deprived of a whole lot of data because a whole lot of interaction has left no traces. And so, for political behavior, we would ask people about their attitudes. In some sense, we use their attitude as a tracer for, we hope, the way they behaved. But there have been tracers in the past. My dissertation was about foreign policy in the late 19th century. And this was before they used telephones on a wide scale. All the interaction between the State Department of Washington and the embassies around the world were written down. So I saw all the interaction, all the planning, all the consideration, all the back and forth, because they had to write things down. When the telephone came in, a whole lot of the interaction disappeared. And so for a long time, there were no tracers at all on this sort of communication. Now again, with the email, people are leaving new forms, they're leaving tracings behind. So that sort of changes, for social science, both the kind of data that's available, but also creates new forms of interaction that you're talking about.
Emily and John?
I want to just add one other thing to this, on the tracers thing. So in our Twitter study, we could do things like track when people have accidents and when people have headaches, when women have contractions. These are things people have been doing for a long time. These are not new kinds of behaviors, but we have new ways of being able to observe the time of day, the day of the week, when people are talking about these things.
So this is great. Thank you for doing this. In public health, there's a lot of interest in behavior change, health promotion, a lot of interest in social networks, clearly, and particularly in terms of how norms get transmitted and other kinds of social influence around health promotion. At the same time, there's been a real movement for what's called place-based kinds of interventions, in a sense, really focusing on a particular geographical location and working on issues like parks, walkability, alcohol outlets, really focusing on sort of what is the physical environment in which people are living, and how does that really, create opportunities or barriers for healthier behavior? And I'm trying to fit together, I'm wondering if you could help me sort of think about examples in which you could really focus on both the social network, but also really think about how it relates to the actual physical environments or the places in which people live. Because when I hear about some of the social network studies and sort of how behaviors get transmitted through networks, I'm always really thinking about, but how does the place in which people live or the actual physical presence or structures interact with that? And I'm just wondering if you could talk about how those analyses could be integrated, or examples in which we can sort of work in both of, combine those.
I have a couple of comments about that. I think that one of the things that's really important to keep in mind is that the idea that in the world of digital technology, place doesn't matter anymore. That's clearly not the case in many important ways. And I think that increasingly people who study digital technology are beginning to see it as situated in places and in actual communities, and not just as cyberspace, that is separated from place. And I think that in public health, that's really important in a lot of ways. One of my favorite studies that involves media and public health is a work by Kleinenberg on the Chicago heat wave of some years ago. And one of the things that he shows is that the people who died were people who were socially isolated. That was the most important factor in mortality. And that had to do with the kinds of neighborhoods in which they lived and just the social character of those neighborhoods. And then he goes on to make an argument that it's something that the media didn't pick up on in their more individualistic conception of health.
I think this goes back to last week's discussion about the city. The modern city anyway, in some sense, was the result of revolution in transportation that made it possible for large numbers of people to live together, to go from home to work, to bring food to the city, which would not have been possible with earlier technologies. And what we're going now is through a communications revolution that I think has in some sense been overstated by a lot of the postmodern claims that the place doesn't matter anymore. And I think that's a very good corrective. Face-to-face interaction is still very important. It takes place within neighborhoods, it takes place within towns. And I think there's a challenge in terms of how do we connect this sort of the web, which is on its face independent of place, and real face-to-face interaction that is very much dependent on place.
One of the things we found in our study of the UK telephone networks, was that people tend to use the phone to call people that they talk to face-to-face. They're not using the phone to cover big distances. They're using the phone to talk to the people they interact with physically.
John?
So thanks for that. Pointing out that cities are nodes in networks, and that networks connect not just people but institutions, and institutions grouped in places, and that's an important dimension. My question is, for all of you, what do you think are the most important insights that have come out of network analysis as it's developed over the past 20 years? I know in my field people have been very struck by Granovetter's idea of the strength of weak ties, that in terms of individual careers. Also Ron Burt's idea of sort of structural holes, that people that can bridge clusters have a kind of power or prominence that people that are just inside one cluster might not have. But beyond those two ideas, what are the other ideas that have really fertile ideas that have come out of this work, would you say?
Well, one is that that for certain types of contagious behaviors, and it's important to note that it applies to certain types, the probability that you will be infected by your neighbors increases not just with the number of your neighbors who are infected, but the number of triangles among those neighbors. That is to say, the number of neighbors who are tied to each other who are infected. And that's I think, a very interesting phenomena that has some implications for granovetter. And then for other kinds of contagions, there's evidence that actually it's the other way around, that when your neighbors are tied to each other, it seems like you discount their influence. So, and I think probably there are some interesting different mechanisms that come out of that. But that's an example of a really recent finding that I found quite interesting.
Yeah, my sense is very close to that some of it goes way back to the origins of network analysis in terms of things like triads and the importance of triads. It's not only who you know that counts, but it's whether they know each other. And you sort of can build up on that into ways that large networks happen. And that very much shapes how diffusion works, how innovations are spread, how disease is spread, how information is spread. That a lot of things that are really have to do with relationships among people are set within these very complex networks that are not only based on dyadic relationships, but based on triads and larger configurations. And that we've made there's been a whole lot of progress in network analysis, in the technologies of network analysis, as well as the availability of data that make it possible to investigate those things in a much more sophisticated way, that we're much less dependent on computing power and mathematics. So we can do things, for example, now we can look at overlapping groups in networks that we couldn't do 10 years ago. 10 years ago, if you wanted to look at groups, you had to assume that they were unconnected to each other, which of course is not the way the real world works.
Another example, Christakis and Fowler's work showing that lots of things that we wouldn't think are necessarily contagious may very well be contagious. I think the jury is out on whether it is definitely true, but there's good evidence that they may be contagious. Obesity is an example. Happiness, altruism. There's some evidence that these things fan out about 3 steps from you. So when you engage in an altruistic act, you're causing not only your neighbors to be more altruistic, but their neighbors and their neighbors. An interesting result. On the other hand, there are other studies which suggest that a lot of that is due to environmental factors and to selection effects, homophily, the tendency for people to prefer to interact with people similar to themselves. But there's a lot of research trying to tease those things out. Another that I'm sure is an area that you're quite familiar with is residential segregation and work that was started by Thomas Schelling and is becoming increasingly empirical, showing that racial segregation need not correspond to ethnic intolerance, that even in a very tolerant population, even in recent studies, even in populations that prefer diversity, they'll still segregate through structural phenomena, through tipping processes that are independent of the attitudes of the people.
Gail?
I'm trying to think, you mentioned email and the fact that every email that we send is stored on some server somewhere until presumably the roaches take over. So it does have a durability, but I've been trying to think about 2 issues. One is, well, issues of access and preservation. With a letter on paper, you can read a letter without a piece of machinery. Some people save their letters, some people don't. Some of the collections of letters that some individuals say will end up in archives and be available, others won't. But that process is somewhat transparent to me. I understand how that works. I'm not at all clear on how email works as an archival source. Some emails are on servers like our university server. Presumably anyone could have access to those emails. But the private emails that we do on our own time presumably are not accessible to just anyone who doesn't get them. And it's not clear to me how they would be, so it's not clear to me if or how they could be accessed now for data, and if and how they would be accessible some years in the future. For example, I had a lot of email on one server. It was a a little nonprofit that had a catastrophic failure. I lost about 10 years of my emails. But the ones I do have are sitting on my computer, and I'm not sure that anyone will ever get them off of that computer. So I'm trying to think of the comparison between email and letter as a source of information, and I was wondering if you had thoughts on that.
Let me put a related issue on the table here. It seems to me that when we're talking about this kind of transaction-generated information, the question of surveillance and the ethics of it it just has to be at the center of it. And there's a very complex history of social science, the development of social science, and the development of surveillance in society. And so once we start talking about using emails and all this transaction generated information as data for social science, then those issues really have to come up.
It also has to do with public and private, that the kind of letters that are available are those that either some private individual or their heirs released. But for the government, especially in this country, we have a Freedom of Information Act. And in fact, government is by law a lot more accountable to the public than private communication. And so I think that's important, that there have been some very interesting Freedom of Information Act actions that have released certain information. There's also theft, which hackers, which we've seen a lot of. Where information has been released that hackers got a hold of. And so I think that's very important.
Both Columbia and Dartmouth have allowed social scientists and information scientists to have access to the email headers, not the content, but the headers, to study friendship formation among the students. They all come in freshman year, they don't know each other, but we know everything about them because the university has all the data about their parents, about their GPAs and the classes they take, and then you can look to see how friendships form over the 4 years and track that. It's really quite a remarkable way of studying how people form friendships across ethnic lines, gender, social class, and so on. Of course, the problem is you can't do that anymore because students don't use email. They use Facebook. They use email to talk to us and their parents.
If I can push that one step further, Google knows what, I don't know whether to put millions or billions of people are doing in terms of emailing each other. Does Google analyze that in any way to understand society as opposed to, place ads?
Well, I'm going to Google tomorrow. I'm spending the day at Google. I'll ask them. That's one of the reasons why I am going, is to find out what are they doing, what are they interested in doing, what are the opportunities for social scientists to use their data.
Which is that many libraries and special collections archives are quite concerned about keeping email. It's not simply a matter of keeping the bits, which you can do by having servers that keep passing on, but the software to read the email is changing over time. So it's a very hard issue. There isn't a solution yet, but there are many people thinking about it. But what you've raised is a very, very good issue. Ellen Goodman handed all of her email over to Radcliffe a couple of years ago, and it's a real challenge to figure out how to read some of it and save some of it and make it accessible to people. Very different from Dear Abby 50 years ago, which all came in on. So it's a very, very good question.
Yeah, we wanted to have this as a general discussion, so I think Barbara's comment is good, that our intention was to have this not just in terms of you guys commenting on us, but also to comment on each other. In some sense, to change the network to be a little bit more decentralized.
By the way, just to comment here about the kind of networks that I study, the Network Evening News is a live show. And most of the early history of it is just lost. The only reason it was taped at all was so that they could refeed it to the West Coast, and they'd rewind the tape each night and then tape right over it the next day. So until the middle of 1968, almost all of the early history of TV news is lost. It is something that I wonder about now. We have all of this incredible amount of, I mean, I can go online and I can find local TV from all over the country. I have a lot of trouble figuring out how it's sampled, what's on there, and I can find YouTube clips that are, recirculated and so on. But I also wonder over time how it's going to be possible to keep all of that material, to deal with it, to make it searchable and so on, as well as the conceptual problem of how you use it, how you sample it, how you weight it, and so on. It's a very interesting change in the sorts of problems we face.
One of the most important, I think, areas of skill development that social and behavioral scientists are going to need to invest heavily in, especially in graduate training, is natural language processing and image processing. So, because with huge numbers of texts, not just emails, but web pages, text messages, Facebook status updates, you can't do it by hand. It has to be machine coded. And developing, and the advances in this area are really breathtaking of what's possible. But social scientists, for the most part, don't know how to do these things. And image processing is rapidly catching up as well, which is going to be important for things like analyzing both video and still images online.
But this has always been a problem that historians have dealt with. When you walk into an archive and you just look down these rows and rows of information, you think, my God, how am I going to, get access to any of this? It's the same problem. It's just now that we have new technologies to make it a lot easier.
Much easier.
Yeah.
Much easier.
Bethany, yeah. Bethany and then Ted, yeah.
Mine's on a different topic. This
I just wanted to say, just to follow up with what you were saying, Michael, another opportunity is for collaboration of social scientists with people in, for example, one of the things I've noticed is Indiana has a school of informatics. And there, a lot of the people that they bring in are computer scientists, but they're also very interested in economics and social science, in business and so forth. And I think that opens up a lot of possibilities for social and behavioral scientists. That is to say, to collaborate with computer scientists and especially people in informatics on dealing with some of these issues. It really, it's a real potential there, I think, that's unrealized yet, just barely realized. Sorry.
No, that's fine. You're talking about sort of the potential that these methodologies introduce, and I'd like to build on that idea. I mean, there's the opportunities that you're discussing for asking different kinds of questions and obtaining different kinds of data, but similarly it then leads to different opportunities for intervention. And I want to share an example from psychology that I heard very recently that I thought was excellent use of the network analysis approach, and then maybe hear from the panel and others in your own discipline sort of interesting ways that you are seeing this improving our ability to intervene for important social and health problems. So I was at a talk where a colleague used network analysis within high school to identify the social networks and who were the leaders at disseminating information that people paid attention to. And then she used those leaders to implement an anti-bullying campaign and saw remarkable reductions in bullying at the end of the year that relative to other programs that have failed in the past when they've tried other approaches. And it really, she described that the key mechanism was figuring out who were the sort of spokes in the wheel in order to do the intervention. I thought it was just a really neat application of some of the things that you're talking about, but I'd be curious to hear in other fields how this is being applied, because obviously the disease dissemination is a perfect example of when one assumes that could lead to huge intervention opportunities.
There was a similar study in a high school on STDs where they located the hubs and were able to reduce the transmission of STDs by analyzing the networks and see not only who the individuals were, but what the structure was, and they tried to restructure the network. And
in politics, obviously, it's manifested in micro-targeting, right? So instead of buying an ad that you're going to put on local TV news that's going to be seen, which is actually itself can be a kind of micro-targeting because you buy you run different ads in different television markets, but it can be individualized much more now. And it can be individualized so that if you go to visit the website of a campaign, what's on the website is going to be different depending on who you are and what information they have about you and your taste. And including, the candidate may have a different position on certain issues depending on who visits the site.
So
Slightly different question. I was curious about the relationship between network analysis and the concept of social capital. And I'd just like to ask you all to comment on that, because social capital is very popular both in economics and sociology now, and I was wondering what the relationship is that you all see between them.
You want to go ahead?
I am not someone who does network analysis in that sense. I do think that this notion of this argument about the strength of weak ties, which comes out of network analysis, is pretty closely connected to the idea of social capital. And I do think that there's a great deal of potential for thinking about social capital in terms of the patterns of interaction among people and the ability of people to use those patterns of interaction. I think social capital has a lot of different dimensions, though, if you break it down. And some of them you're probably susceptible to analysis by network analysis.
In sociology, there have been two strains of social capital. Maybe three, but one is the Bourdieuian sense that is basically who do you know, and doesn't go very far in terms of network analysis. And then there's a tradition coming out of James Coleman's work that's very much looks at networks and not only who do you know, but who do they know, and this is where the weak ties come from. Weak ties are not only, I think it's important. Weak ties are not only ties that are weak in the sense of somebody you don't know very well, like a friend versus a family, but they're also weak in terms of they are linked to other people that you don't necessarily know. A strong tie is a tie where, like a family, where the people that you know each other. And one of the reasons you can't find jobs through strong ties is because they all know about the same stuff, but they don't have very many connections beyond that little circle. And so the weak ties are circles that go far. And so, in that sense, the network analysis has been very much tied up with social capital and network have been very much tied up together in a lot of the studies by people like Miller McPherson and so forth, very much use network techniques to study social capital.
Our paper using the UK phone data, the central finding in that paper was about social capital. What we found is that there's a surprisingly strong correlation between the socioeconomic position of the members of a community and the network structures in which those people are embedded. And the people who have open network structures with ties that span longer network distances, those communities tend to be economically advantaged.
This is related to the issue that I wanted to raise about information inequality in the current media environment, because I think there are lots of questions you can raise about whether, for example, the reemergence of partisan media increases social capital in certain groups, because it means that those groups have powerful common frameworks for interpreting information about politics and means of mobilizing that that if you read Tocqueville writing about newspapers, he describes newspapers as essentially vehicles for collective action, right? That he didn't think of them as providing information that individual citizens use to make decisions. He thought of them as being connected to political associations of various ways and vehicles of collective action. And so partisan media can perform that role and might increase social capital for groups in that way. But it is also true that these are niche media, right? Partisan media are niche media. Most people are not exposed to them. And to the extent that the general population has lower levels of political information, that may lower the kind of aggregate of social capital out there in the country. There's interesting comparative studies that show the differences in political information between different countries, and the main explanation for that has to do with public service broadcasting, right? And the fact that the countries with high, just aggregate levels of political information have public service broadcasting that always has news in prime time, and they have large inadvertent audiences that are exposed to that information. A system like ours has increasingly people aren't exposed to political information just going about their daily television watching. It's increasingly a niche form of programming. And so you could make an argument that the general stock of social capital is diminished by that.
Can I ask a question in terms of political science theory? When I learned political sociology coming through, we learned about pluralism, and that pluralism was a theory that basically said that decentralized structures are more democratic. And if you imagine, the pluralists, Polsby and those people writing in the 50s, present to them, okay, there's this new technology and people can interact with each other much more directly, and that they, not only in terms of person to person, but in terms of clusters of people, that's got to be more democratic, right, according to pluralist theory.
So it's a lot less pluralistic.
That's the question. Is it because it's less pluralistic, or because it was something that the pluralists didn't foresee? I mean, was there something in the theory that couldn't predict this? Or
well, the pluralists always had this other part of their argument that had to do with cross-cutting cleavages, and the extent to which you have correlations among all of the different divisions, and that they saw as undercutting. So it's the polarization, democracy, like you said before. Okay. Right. I also think that these changes that we're talking about are quite complex, and the idea, in some ways, the contemporary system is more decentralized, you could say. In some ways, it is. But in other ways, it's not. The internet has great potential for centralization. Right. It has the potential to increase what media economists often talk about as the phenomenon of one-way flows from large media markets to small media markets. So, in a certain way, radio is much more centralized now than it once was, right? Instead of lots of local radio stations, each one of which has news, now you have Rush Limbaugh going out to everybody across the country. So it's not self-evident that it isn't always more decentralized. It's a pretty complex set of changes that are going on, and some of them are actually more centralized.
But in addition, there's this process that Bishop talks about in the big sort, that people increasingly can choose to limit their information to just the stuff that they already agree with or pretty much agree with, and that reinforces a tendency for people to form to break down the cross-cutting cleavages, and you move away from a pluralistic pattern. And actually, this was a question that I wanted to ask you, Dan. So, why is it that MSNBC and Fox News, by the way, that's spelled F-A-U-X for those of you, why is it that MSNBC and Fox News have this display this polarizing tendency where the left likes to watch MSNBC, the right likes to watch Fox News? Why didn't that happen with NBC and ABC? I mean, it seems like in principle it could have happened 20 years ago, and ABC would have evolved to be, the left-wing broadcaster and NBC the right-wing. Why didn't that happen 20 years ago?
My argument about that,
40 years ago.
I mean, there are two kinds of explanations, right? One of them has to do with changes in political culture. So our political culture is more polarized, and that started happening before these changes in the structure of the media. It started happening sometime in the 1970s, and that may affect it. But I actually think the main reason has to do with the structure of media markets, and that you have these kind of centrist media in highly concentrated markets. Network television, which was also governed by the fairness doctrine, but also the monopoly local newspaper market, and in multi-channel media markets, partisanship has always been a business tactic of product differentiation, essentially. That's how it is in the British national newspaper market. And when you had the emergence of cable television and television changed from being a three-network oligopoly to all of these different channels, it seems to me it was natural that partisanship should be a way of developing a market niche for news, just as it was with in the days when there were 14 English language newspapers in New York City.
I mean, one of the aspects of this is the declining trust that you have in the mainstream media. Now, given the niche markets, the self-selection into the networks and so forth, you do have this capacity where you can get your news and what you think the culture's being exposed to that are views that never challenge your views. They just reinforce your views. And it's very interesting to see how both on the right and the left, but especially on the right, the amount of the growing distrust in terms of the mainstream media. An anecdote, we're bringing Jim Lair to Indiana University. And when we sent this out to the community to announce this, we got some very negative responses from some of the people who said, why, this is just propaganda. Why do we want to bring such a person to Indiana who would just feed on the liberal bias that's already in the, so it's not, the segmentation, I think, it really reduces the space of kind of the common public space, just about, what are the facts of politics, the facts of social life, and so forth. They're all being contested now because there is no, Walter Cronkite or, a successor and so forth that has that kind of prominence and so forth. And so our kind of public vocabulary is being weakened, I think, just the capacity to, we're reinforcing our own views increasingly, and we lack opportunities, and people don't take advantage of the opportunities to have their own ideas challenged. They don't like that. And so you get in situations where just the whole nature of the facts that you're talking about in particular situations are, no one can even agree on the facts, much less the evidence to back them up or the arguments and so forth.
Yeah, there's a theory among people who work on public opinion that you used to have a fairly standard process by which you would have partisan divisions on a lot of issues, not only in terms of opinions, but in terms of the reality judgments, right? And then over time you would have convergence so that partisan differences would disappear. And the argument is that process doesn't work anymore. And so you very often have increasing partisan gaps over time. I would say I looked at a lot of this research before this presentation to see what to present from it. I would say it's less well documented at this point less fully than I had imagined, but I think that there's definitely some evidence for it. One of the clearest cases is global warming, right, where there was the beginnings of that process going on and then it reversed. And there's very strong evidence that the reversal of it is related to cable news, right? So that there's very strong effects of watching Fox, for example, in the turnaround among Republicans and the reemergence of a partisan divide.
My question is related to some of these previous questions, and it's about the persuasive power of political communication. What do we know about whether it has increased because of the president, for example, could not only give a State of the Union address, but also tweet and use social media, or has it diminished because people are so inundated? Does that weaken the ability to actually move people in opinion polls? And looking at it from the other end of the spectrum, would a grassroots protest movement be more likely to affect opinion, being able to reach so many people, or are the vast majority being drowned in an ocean of noise?
I don't know if others want to come in on this, but I would say that there were probably a lot of ways in which it's more difficult to shape public opinion, right? So, I mean, for the president to influence public opinion is harder now, partly because it's harder for him to get the message out, right? A lot of people aren't going to be exposed to it, but also partly because you're going to have segments of the population that are going to be exposed to hostile, hostile version of that. So we're going to watch Fox, and Fox is going to be attacking the president. So this disaggregation, I think, makes it more difficult. There are also arguments, and then there's another set of arguments about, so this is talking about how much the president can influence public opinion. When you're talking about how much media themselves influence public opinion, there's a kind of debate about whether this selectivity diminishes it because people are just being exposed to what was already their view to begin with, or actually enhances it because the viewers of Fox have high trust in Fox and are therefore more likely to be influenced than they would have under the old system, and similarly with MSNBC. And there's actually evidence for both of those processes.
Regarding your question about grassroots insurgents, we collected all the tweets from North Africa and the Middle East during the Arab Spring period. Well, not all of them, a lot of them. And we were interested to test this claim that Malcolm Gladwell and others had, that the revolution will not be tweeted. And what we found, we did not find evidence that the revolution was tweeted, actually, in the sense that people were mobilizing. So when we looked at the upticks in Twitter traffic about that contain protest hashtags. And these, by the way, these were tweets generated in country. These are not the West talking about. These are tweets being generated inside Egypt. We found that the big upticks happen after the outbreak, not before. And that suggests that it's operating as an echo. It's echoing what's happening in the streets. It's not being used to get people out into the streets. On the other hand, what we're now looking at, though, is the diffusion aspect, because when that echo occurs, it reverberates. And so we think that that's probably a much more important role that Twitter played and blogs played in the Arab Spring, is in the diffusion of the protest, not in the mobilization at the grassroots level.
I would want to also find out more about the person-to-person networks in which media is experienced. The old theory is a two-step process where the media is watched by opinion makers, and opinion makers talk to other people, and that's how public opinion gets spread. There's recent research that is doubting that, to say it's a lot more complex than that. It's difficult to identify who the opinion makers are. But people talk about what they see in the media, and they don't always take it literally. And so I think influence is going to be very complex. If we go back to the Vietnam War era, this was sort of the classic case of the media following public opinion in terms of opposition to the war. And it was reportedly when Lyndon Johnson heard that Walter Cronkite had come out against the war, that he decided he shouldn't run again. I don't know whether that's apocryphal or not, but
Yeah, it is apocryphal.
okay. Okay.
It was a much more complex process. He had advisors who had been telling him for a long time that the policy wasn't working and so on.
Okay.
But it was a symbol.
Yeah, but that was a situation in which the media followed public opinion. So I think it's a very complex issue, and we still need to know more about how people talk about the media than just how they experience it directly.
I was going to end on a somewhat dystopic note, and I'm not sure that's the best place to end, but I was reading an article in the New York Times Magazine about habit formation, and they were, one of the examples that they were using in the article was about how Target, the company, uses a sort of analysis of information to figure out which of their customers are pregnant, because they have found out that during pregnancy people are likely to change their buying habits. And it was really quite astounding to think about how they did, to read about how they did this, and how in one instance they figured out that a young woman was pregnant before her family knew, and the father came in, saying, "Why are you sending my daughter, advertisements for diapers?" and later found out that in fact this was appropriate. So the level of, this goes back to your point, Dan, about surveillance. The level of surveillance is quite, I guess my point is that there are opportunities for research, but there are also, even those research opportunities create opportunities for other kinds of activity that may not be so benign or may be more troubling. So just the level of surveillance is quite astounding. And that article about figuring out that this girl was pregnant really kind of caught me by surprise to think about how they, the sophistication of the tools that have been developed to do that.
How did they figure out she was pregnant?
They have a whole, you have to read the article, but a whole lot of data collection about other things that they figured out or associated in terms of. No, it wasn't that direct.
The buying habits.
Buying habits,
Right,
okay.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was really kind of breathtaking to.
But in fact, I mean, all the websites you visit are recorded. And someone who is pregnant who goes on Google to get some information, that's recorded somewhere. And people, I think, are not sufficiently, even people who should know better, are not sufficiently savvy or aware of just how exposed and how vulnerable they are when they go on the web. And there are things you can do to protect yourself, but I don't think people are using them or are aware of them.
Maybe we could have a discussion about those protective measures.
If you think what Target is doing is potentially intrusive, the security organs of the United States are surveilling the global web constantly. And
Target wasn't looking at the web, it was looking at
Its own data, right, yes.
Administrative data, but I'm just saying, in terms of pattern recognition and terabytes of data and analysis of it, the security agencies are way ahead of everyone else.
Wonderful. Thank you very much.
Okay.